The autumn of 1829 hung over New Orleans like damp silk, heat pooling in the gutters and ticking in the iron fences of the Garden District, where white columned houses posed as if they were saints with secrets. On Prytania Street, a smaller residence kept its eyes shut, shutters latched, garden riotous with jasmine and oleander, a brass plate polished to a lie, Maison de Grace, private academy for young ladies. Celestini Vasari arrived with the self-possession of someone who has rehearsed her entrance. A widow's black, a Creole lilt sanded smooth by European schools, letters of introduction as neat as a row of pins. The neighbors learned as much as they were meant to. She educated orphaned girls of good birth, charity rendered respectable through discretion. But Celestine's true curriculum lived behind closed wood and quiet footfalls. She had studied the arithmetic of the slaveholding South and solved for profit. New men with new money wanted what old families guarded: wives who could pass, who would manage labor and linens, church pews and heirloom names, who came with no fathers to inquire and no brothers to threaten, women who were gratitude embodied and history erased. An economy wants what it cannot name. Celestine gave it a euphemism and then a doorbell. She mapped the cotton belt like a banker's ledger: Charleston, Mobile, Savannah, Richmond. She learned how much grief fetched on a weekday afternoon and what color of ribbon softened suspicion. If the city asked why her pupils were never seen in public, she answered with the thick language of tragedy. If anyone pressed about origins, she let the silence say, fever, ruin, ruin, fever. The house itself acquired the habits of complicity, learning to swallow laughter and postpone footsteps. And in that hush, polished, prayerful, profitable, the work began. Her first acquisition was catalogued the way a chair might be: Charleston, October, a bankrupt estate, 3 children, 2 boys gone quick to the fields, a small girl left to the echoes of the auctioneer's throat. $70. A sum one could hold in a pocket and never think about again, unless thinking was the point. The paper called her Celia. Celestine called her Claire DeVoe, and inventoried the conversion on the return journey. Burn the rough cloth, teach the eyes to lower not in terror, but in modesty. Erase the old syllables and lay down new ones like tracks. You are from Mobile. Your parents died of fever. You remember nothing that can be verified. Memory, in Celestine's hands, became a room with the windows painted shut. At Maison de Grace, Claire learned the alphabet of silence before the one on the page. Dawn meant needlework until blood hummed at the fingertips. Noon meant accounts, little columns that stacked obedience into arithmetic. Dusk meant manners, how grace can be a gate, how the right laugh has no weight, how genealogies are the braille of belonging. Priests visited and left soot of approval. Tutors came and went like harmless weather. Meanwhile, the house itself served as textbook and test: cooking, laundering, clean ledgers, spotless corners, a sky of rules. Celestine perfected the science of unasking. If a girl cried, she was tired. If she refused a name, she was willful. If she remembered, she was mistaken. It is difficult to prove a past when the present has better paperwork. The walls held sound like a confession, and outside the city applauded a charity it never examined, because gratitude is the easiest forgery to believe. In this way, a child became a young lady, and a young lady became a commodity that walked and curtsied and did not exist before the age of 10. The debut sale had the sanctity of a wedding and the discretion of a debt. In March 1834, Claire, documents insisting she was 16, the clock insisting she was barely 14, married Thomas Hargrave of Natchez, who made money the way a river makes curves: patient, inevitable, a little muddy. The ceremony was sparse and clean, the priest well acquainted with Celestine's donations, the vows spoken in a voice that had been ironed flat. $3,000 crossed a private threshold under the bilingual cover of Charity and Introduction. No receipt, because truth should never be forced to corroborate itself. In Natchez, Claire mastered domestic invisibility. Guests fed, accounts balanced, linens a white so severe it could blind you. At night, the body remembered what the mouth had been taught to forget. She woke with her pulse running and no name to chase. Over 4 years, she bore 3 children, each proof that legitimacy is an act as much as a lineage. Celestine scaled on the strength of that proof. The network grew its own polite vocabulary, a lawyer who knew of a young lady, a broker who could make an introduction, notes phrased like lace. Payments rose to $5,000. Properties were acquired in Charleston and Mobile, like bookmarks saving places in a story she could reopen at will. The Maison doubled its numbers, then doubled again, while the training refined into a ritual that separated self from survival with surgical neatness. Some girls collapsed into a quiet that looked like piety. Some learned to wear a smile as if it were corsetry, tight enough to reshape bone. A few ran and were returned by men whose uniforms made cruelty look like courtesy. To maintain such immaculate untruth required a new category of devotion. Celestine supplied it, and the city, relieved to see orphans rescued and men properly married, laundered its conscience in public prayer. The first real trouble did not arrive as thunder. It entered as a question with clean fingernails. In 1842, a young wife, Anne Durand by the papers, visited a New Orleans lawyer to ask whether a woman could contest the truth of her own beginnings. The question wobbled the furniture. Philip Renard, who held a belief in order but also a private fondness for proof, followed the seam until fabric parted. Letters that led to Charleston, certificates that floated but never landed, parish registers that rang true like glass and yet contained no weight. Anne brought fragments that behaved like dreams, skin remembered darker than a mirror allowed, a name that arrived in sleep and left at waking, a sister shaped only by absence. Renard discovered 4 more wives in the city alone, with the same bright veneer and the same dark silence beneath. His inquiries mapped a quiet constellation across Savannah, Mobile, Natchez, young women with perfect manners and no childhood anyone could touch. He asked a judge for the name of the crime. The judge poured brandy and recited the Catechism of Order. If the children were purchased legally, if the papers are correct, if the marriages are valid, then the law has already pronounced its blessing. To unwind such knots would embarrass the rope. Husbands would be implicated as buyers, priests as notarizers, clerks as conspirators. Children, white and free by parchment, would be made precarious by truth. Law prefers a lie that keeps its shoes clean. Renard shelved the formal case but made his own archive, sealed and secret. Names nested like dolls, sums penciled in, roots from block to bridle couched in a lawyer's patience. He told Anne the kindest cruelty. Live the life the papers gave you. Truth, in this city, is an illness with no doctor. Thus the mechanism endured not because no one saw, but because everyone did. Husbands who chose quiet over clarity, priests who counted alms as absolution, officials who wore the blindfold as a uniform. A society is a chorus of selective hearing. Celestine merely conducted. Resistance came from the places documentation refuses to hear. Quarters behind big houses, Sunday gatherings where time briefly remembered itself, kitchens where recipes and rumors were both memorized by repetition. The story moved as water does, seeking low ground and carrying silt. Girls purchased with a smile, vanishing into a house with shut eyes, reappearing years later as mistresses who could not place their own first songs. A Creole priest, Father Antoine Allaire, listened because listening was his parish. He collected testimonies not for court but for conscience. 23 girls traced, 17 matched to marriages, 5 dead, one missing into the wordless space where paper ends. When he brought his ledger of sorrow to the archbishop, he received the sacrament of silence. Burn this and be reassigned. He did not burn it. Farther north, a woman who could have passed for anyone fled a marriage in Savannah and told her story to abolitionists who didn't know what to do with a witness whose face unsettled their categories. She named the room without windows and the lessons that unhooked memory from bone. She named the threats that came folded like linens, a bill of sale kept in a safe, a sister named as collateral, obedience as the only exit. In May 1847, public pressure made the city perform justice. A grand jury convened. Celestine arrived armored in black silk and documentation. 5 pupils testified with tears that could be cued by a metronome: mobile, fever, charity, gratitude. Each narrative a vellum map copied so many times, the edges had become truer than the coast. The prosecutor probed and touched nothing but story. One girl offered memories borrowed from a popular novel, and no one recognized the quotation because fiction often rhymes with what we need to believe. The jury found nothing to indict except their own discomfort. Celestine walked out into summer, a little dimmer in rumor, polished in law. But a merchant on the panel had seen soldiers' eyes before. He knew that blankness can be a kind of scream. He wrote to the governor, to a paper, to Renard. He received, in order, filing, refusal, companionship. The archive thickened. The city applauded itself for its restraint. The unraveling was not a collapse so much as a fray, the way a hem loosens with each handling until a dress remembers it was once cloth. After the hearings, introductions grew harder to arrange. Brokers developed allergies to certain names. Payments diminished and arrived with questions attached. Inside the maison, the discipline tightened into something that looked like fear. One girl refused her assigned name and answered only to child, a rebellion so small it filled the room. She hanged herself in August 1848, leaving behind a silence that moved like weather through the halls. Another began to speak in a voice that belonged to an earlier house and a different mother. A doctor named it hysteria and prescribed cold water and loneliness until the voice learned to hide. She married a man in Baton Rouge and lived long enough to teach her grandchildren how to fold napkins, and sometimes, only sometimes, to whisper to herself in a language they mistook for a game. A letter surfaced beside a bed where a young mother died of what the physician called melancholy and the page called exhaustion of the soul. She wrote that she had become proficient at lying until truth felt like a foreign spice. She wrote of children whose questions were answered with stories carefully stitched from air. She wrote of dreams that returned with smells she could not name, and a lullaby that knew her better than any mirror. Survival had asked a price, and she had paid with the only currency she owned, herself. Between 1847 and 1849, 12 women connected to the Maison died in ways the city could understand individually, but not collectively. Fever, childbirth, decline, accidents, each death a bead that meant little until you held the string. Statistics were not yet a language. Had they been, they might have spoken plainly. Instead, grief scattered into separate parlors and was folded into separate Bibles, and the story remained convenient. Celestine died in November 1849, the heart named as culprit because the heart is both organ and metaphor and therefore satisfies the paperwork. The girls stood in her room the way one stands at the edge of the sea at night, aware of depths and relieved by darkness. A priest took her confession and came out looking older in the light. He offered nothing but the ritual, which is a kind of mercy when facts are a kind of blade. Her estate scattered into charities like coins thrown to keep a boat lucky. Maison de Grace became, for a while, a family's address. Later, renovations found a small room, sealed behind a false wall, its air thick with the arithmetic of marks. days counted by fingernail, names carved to keep from vanishing, phrases that no one on site could read. Concrete closed the discovery because some histories are easier to bury than to bless. The last 7 pupils were dispersed as if the city were tidying a table. 3 married in haste, 2 sent to institutions that welcomed their perfect documents like dowries, 2 simply gone, uncollected by any ledger but rumor. Renard's archive slept under a clerk's key. Father Allaire's copies traveled along the same quiet routes that had conveyed the girls once upon a market. In 1921, researchers opened the seals and found more than story. Deposits mapped like crop yields, the sum of 20 years approaching a small fortune, names that had been made of smoke pressed suddenly into clay. Newspapers fluttered, families protested, the file dozed again. Yet the tale survives in the only durable medium oppression cannot regulate: mouths. A granddaughter hears from a grandmother about a woman who sang a song that does not fit on a family tree. A photograph won't sit right on a mantel. Someone cleaning an attic finds a letter with apologies that outlive the hand. And somewhere a house keeps its shutters very clean, the wood smelling faintly of lemon oil and secrets, and the street goes on as if nothing ever happened there except ordinary days and the ordinary weather of a city that specializes in forgetting.